I remember the way he sat there, across from me, looking so small in his chair, his shoulders hunched like he could somehow shrink away from what he was about to tell me. It was late, after the kids were asleep, and the house was quiet, too quiet. He started speaking in this low, barely their voice, like he hoped if he spoke softly enough, the words wouldn't hit so hard. But I heard every syllable, clear as day, like each word had been carved into my skin. "I've done something terrible," he said, his voice shaking, his hands clutching his coffee cup until his knuckles went white. And before I could process what he'd said, he looked away from me and dropped the bombshell. The air around us felt thick, like it had turned to smoke, and I was drowning in it. My ears started ringing, drowning out every sound except the echo of his words. I could see his mouth moving, could feel his apology hanging in the air between us, but it was like I was watching it from far away. The man I loved, the father of our children, was admitting to something that would change everything. It was like I'd been pulled underwater, and there was no reaching the surface. I was lost somewhere between anger, disbelief, and pure numbness. I couldn't say a word. I just sat there, staring at him, trying to understand how this could be real. This was my husband, the man I'd built a life with, my rock, the person I'd trusted with every part of myself. And now, in one moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about us, about him, wasn't true. He kept talking, saying he was sorry, but I couldn't hear it. I felt like I was breaking into 1,000 pieces, and the pieces were too small to ever fit back together. Eventually, I got up. My legs were shaking, but somehow I made it to our bedroom. I closed the door behind me and just sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, but nothing came. I just sat there in silence, trapped in this endless loop of disbelief and anger, numbness washing over me. The days blurred together after that. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I'd go through the motions, making breakfast for the kids, helping them with their homework, tucking them into bed, but it felt like I wasn't really there. Every time I tried to shake myself out of it, to get a grip, that wave of grief would crash over me again, stronger than the last time. It was like I was carrying this enormous weight that I couldn't put down. Friends would call, concerned when they didn't hear from me. I ignored them all. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear their reassurances, their advice. It felt like I was drifting, my entire world reduced to that single, horrible fact. He had betrayed me. The kids could tell something was wrong. They'd look at me with those worried eyes, asking if I was okay, and I'd force a smile, lie, and say, "Mommy's just tired." But they knew. Kids always know when something's broken. The fog I'd been living in for weeks finally started to lift, and with it came a clarity I hadn't felt since he'd dropped that bombshell. I was no longer the broken woman sitting in that dark room, lost in confusion and grief. Instead, a new part of me surfaced, sharp, cold, and focused. I wanted to know everything he hadn't told me. He'd said he was sorry, that it was over, that he'd do anything to repair what he'd broken. But I needed proof. I wanted to see every lie he'd kept hidden, every secret he'd buried. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. This was about reclaiming my power. He had taken away my sense of security, my faith in him, and left me in a pit of uncertainty. Now it was my turn. If he was going to pull the rug out from under our lives, then I was going to dig up every detail. And deep down, in the rawest part of my anger, I knew it wasn't only about finding out the truth. I wanted him to feel even a sliver of the shock and devastation he'd thrown at me. My first step was to get access to his phone. It sat there every night, charging on his side of the bed. At first, I hesitated, feeling guilty for even thinking about going through his messages. But then I remembered that he'd already crossed the line, broken every vow. Privacy had been shattered the day he made the choice to cheat, and I was left only with the pieces he hadn't bothered to hide. Late one night, when he'd finally drifted off to sleep, I crept out of bed and took his phone, sitting in the bathroom with the door closed and the lights dimmed. I started with his recent messages, scrolling through texts with coworkers, friends, his brother. Most of it was normal chatter. Office updates, jokes, links to articles, but I couldn't help feeling that I was missing something that he'd cleaned up before telling me. I dug deeper, scanning his social media messages, his call log, anything that might lead me to a clue. Finally, in his email's trash folder, I found an old message chain. It was vague, but I saw her name, Rebecca. The tone was casual, but there was a subtle familiarity in their words, a kind of shorthand between them. My heart pounded as I scrolled down, reading each line, my mind filling in the blanks. There wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me that whatever he'd had with her, it had been real, intimate. My curiosity turned into a quiet, seething anger. He had been so careful to erase every trace, but he'd missed this one tiny breadcrumb. I couldn't stop now. Every night, I went further, searching through everything I could access. He must have sensed something, must have seen the way I would go silent or pull away when he tried to reach out to me, but he didn't say anything. Maybe he thought it was just part of the fallout, my cold shoulder, my detached gaze. But he had no idea that every minute I wasn't speaking to him, I was planning, gathering, and taking back control. I wasn't just collecting information for the sake of knowing. There was a part of me that wanted to build an arsenal. Each piece of evidence felt like a weapon, something I could wield if I needed to, if I wanted to confront him in a way he'd never forget. There was a rush in knowing I had the power to reveal everything he'd tried to hide. The next part of my plan was setting up a tracking app on his phone. I needed to know where he went during the day, whether there were places he went that he hadn't mentioned, or time blocks he'd left unaccounted for. One evening, when he stepped out to take a call on the porch, I downloaded the app, linking it to my phone so that I'd get alerts whenever he went somewhere new. My heart was pounding as I hit install, feeling both the thrill of control and the weight of what I was doing. When he came back inside, he looked at me with tired eyes, as though he wanted to talk, but I turned away, already focused on what my next move would be. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with tracking him, looking for any sign that he was slipping up. I watched his location like a hawk, hoping to catch him in another lie. I'd sit at the kitchen table, watching the little dot on my screen moving between work, the grocery store, picking up the kids, never straying from the routine he described. It was almost disappointing to see him behave so predictably. But every time I saw his location pop up at work or home, I felt a strange satisfaction. It was like I was training myself to trust the tracker, to rely on the facts instead of his words. Then I decided to dig deeper into our phone bill, looking at the call history in more detail. It was tedious work, scrolling through months of numbers, but eventually, I spotted patterns, sequences of missed calls, sometimes at odd hours. One number popped up more frequently than others, and my stomach dropped when I recognized it as hers. There were no recent calls, but seeing her number scattered across our past months felt like a slap. My eyes burned as I traced every missed call, every time he told me he was running late, or just wrapping up, every time he'd lied. I felt like I was spiraling, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. It was as though I'd opened a door I couldn't close, and the flood of information just kept coming. But as much as I dug, as many receipts as I gathered, there was still no clear smoking gun beyond what he'd already confessed. He was still coming home every night, his phone clean, his behavior almost painfully ordinary. I started to wonder if I was reaching, trying to find more to punish him with, something to justify the anger that kept me awake at night. And then came the night I almost confronted him. I had just finished checking the location tracker again. It showed he was at work, right where he said he'd be. The kids were asleep, and he was sitting on the couch, watching TV, oblivious. I sat there, staring at him, willing myself to say something. I wanted to lash out, to scream and tell him I knew everything, that I'd seen every detail he thought he'd hidden. My hand clenched around my phone, and I could feel the heat of my anger rising, my heart racing as I watched him sit there, relaxed, as if nothing had happened. But something stopped me. It was a quiet voice in my mind, one that cut through the noise of my anger. What would this really change? The question hit me hard, making me pause. He looked over at me, sensing my gaze, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd loved all these years, the man I'd built a life with. He looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying this guilt around like a weight he couldn't put down. I turned away, holding back my anger, not out of forgiveness, but because I realized that if I let it out now, it would consume me entirely. Instead, I let the silence hang between us, watching him as he shifted, uneasy, not knowing the storm I'd been harboring for weeks. That night, I stayed up, thinking through every piece of information I'd gathered, every little clue I'd clung to in my search for revenge. The next day, he came home early, bringing flowers, something he hadn't done in years. He handed them to me with a look of quiet desperation, like he was searching for a way back into my heart. I took them, not saying a word, and he just looked down, the weight of his regret hanging heavy in the room. I watched him, the way he carried himself, the way his shoulders slumped as he left the room. For the first time, I wondered if he was already punishing himself, far more deeply than I ever could. In the days that followed, I found myself rethinking everything I'd uncovered. I still felt betrayed, still angry, but something in me began to question what revenge would really accomplish. I had thought that if I could hurt him back, if I could make him feel what I felt, it would somehow restore the balance, make things right. But watching him, seeing his guilt and shame, I realized that no amount of anger would undo what had happened, and that carrying this grudge was only weighing me down further. I didn't forgive him that day, or even the next. It was a slow process, a painful, reluctant journey. We started talking again, bit by bit, peeling back the layers of hurt and resentment. There were days when I wanted to throw everything I'd found in his face, to remind him of what he'd done. But I held back, realizing that moving forward required a different kind of strength. It meant letting go of the need for revenge, of the desire to punish. Months later, I looked back on those dark weeks, on the relentless search for evidence, the obsession with knowing every detail, and I saw how it had nearly consumed me. I saw how, in my pain, I'd nearly lost myself, and in letting go, I found a strange sense of peace, a sense that maybe we could rebuild, that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving between us. The first time I picked up his phone, my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly grip it. It was late at night, and the house was finally silent after a long day. Our kids were asleep, and he was lying right beside me, breathing evenly, drifting in and out of sleep. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought he might wake up and ask what was wrong. But he just turned over, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I knew if I started looking, there was no going back. Once I opened that door, every part of our life was going to change. I stared at the screen, my face illuminated in the dim light, and I swiped to unlock it, my fingers tense and cold. He hadn't changed his passcode, almost as if he'd trusted I'd never look, or maybe that I'd never question him. But here I was, a different person than I'd been just a few weeks ago. He'd turned me into this, and I told myself, over and over, that it was his fault I was doing this. I started with his messages, scrolling through the threads with people I knew. His coworkers, his brother, a few of our mutual friends. It was mostly ordinary stuff, work plans, meeting times, messages about weekend get-togethers. But then, as I looked at the times on some of the messages, I noticed gaps. He'd told me that night he was staying late at work, but here were the gaps in the texts, a strange silence from him during times when I knew he should have been free to send a message, even a small one, telling me he'd be home late. My heart sank. I felt like I was reading between the lines, finding betrayal in every pause. Next, I opened his email, quickly scanning through. His inbox was cluttered, like always, filled with work emails and newsletters he'd probably signed up for years ago and never unsubscribed from. My heart jumped every time I saw a female name or a familiar subject line, but nothing concrete turned up. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, some small clue buried in the ordinary words he'd sent every day. But I needed more than a gut feeling. I needed something real, something I could point to. I remembered reading about location tracking apps, apps that could follow his phone's location with pinpoint accuracy, down to the minute. I decided to take that next step, even though it made me feel like a stranger in my own home. When he got up to brush his teeth, I seized the moment. My fingers flew across the screen, installing the app as quickly as I could, my heart racing at the thought of him walking back in and seeing me in the middle of it. Just as he turned the doorknob, I finished, slipping his phone back onto the nightstand as if nothing had happened. My breath came in shallow bursts as I lay there, pretending to scroll through my own phone, acting like everything was normal, even though it was anything but. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept watching his location on my phone, even though I knew exactly where he was, in our bed, right beside me. But I wanted to test the app to make sure it would work when I needed it. Every few minutes, I'd check, making sure it showed the little dot right on our house. It felt surreal, like I was in a spy movie, tracking someone who was supposed to be the closest person in my life. I stared at that dot, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. My world had turned into a game of cat and mouse, and I was both the hunter and the hunted. Over the next few days, I kept up my investigation, silently, watching, waiting for him to slip up. After he'd fall asleep each night, I'd pick up his phone again, scrolling through his contacts. Some were familiar, names I knew well, people he'd known for years. But there were numbers I didn't recognize, people he'd never mentioned before. I'd screenshot every contact that felt even slightly out of place, keeping a small file on my own phone. I was cataloging every detail, building a case in my mind, so that when I confronted him, I'd have all the proof I needed. I wanted him to see that I'd found it all, that he couldn't hide anything from me. Some nights, I'd hear him breathing softly beside me, his chest rising and falling so peacefully, and I'd feel this incredible urge to wake him up, to shove the phone in his face and demand answers. My fingers would hover above his shoulder, itching to shake him awake and demand the truth. But I held back. I reminded myself that I needed to stay patient, that I wasn't ready. Like a habit, something I checked more often than I cared to admit. Every time I looked, the little dot was right where he said he'd be. At his office during work hours, at the grocery store when he'd promised to pick up dinner supplies, parked at our son's soccer field when he'd said he'd watch practice. I scrutinized every place he went, every hour he was away from home, hoping to catch him somewhere he hadn't told me about, somewhere that would confirm my worst fears. But it never happened. His routine was almost maddeningly ordinary. Part of me hoped I'd missed something in those locations, that maybe he was meeting someone somewhere I hadn't thought to check. I considered adding more apps to his phone, maybe something that could tell me more about his activity. But every step I took down that road made me feel like I was digging myself into a hole I'd never get out of. I felt caught between wanting to move on and this need to keep looking, to find something, anything, that would justify all this suspicion, all the hours I'd spent scouring through his life behind his back. Every night, after he'd fallen asleep, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I'd think back to every excuse he'd given me in the past, every late night, every business trip, trying to piece together moments that could add up to the proof I was so desperate to find. I'd remember all the times he'd been late or hadn't answered his phone right away, and my mind would twist those memories until every innocent explanation seemed suspicious. But the more I looked, the more I came up with nothing. Nothing but his empty apologies, his insistence that it had been a mistake, a one-time lapse. It wasn't enough. My mind wouldn't accept that he could betray me and then simply go back to being the man I trusted. I felt like I'd been robbed of something precious, like he'd taken a part of me and shattered it, leaving me to pick up the pieces alone. And as the days dragged on, that feeling of betrayal only deepened. I kept checking, kept looking, my anger refusing to settle. I started to resent his normality, the way he seemed to have gone back to his routine while I was left to navigate the wreckage. He'd say goodnight, give me a soft smile, and close his eyes, while I lay there wondering if any of it had ever been real. I was furious at him, but also furious at myself, for needing this revenge, for being unable to let it go, for feeling like I was losing myself to this endless, pointless search. Eventually, I started to question why I was doing it. Was I hoping to find more just to hurt him back? Or was I just scared to stop, to face the truth that maybe there was nothing left to find, that he was telling the truth about it being over? But that part of me that wanted justice wouldn't let go. It kept pushing me to dig, to search, to scrutinize every moment of his day. I was clinging to this twisted sense of control, hoping to find something that would make me feel powerful again, something that would give me back the upper hand. But every day, I felt more trapped, caught in this cycle I couldn't escape. One night, as I sat in our dimly lit living room, my hands shaking as I scrolled through his messages for what felt like the 100th time. I heard his footsteps behind me. Before I could put his phone down or even look up, he was there, standing in the doorway. The light from the screen illuminated his face, and I could see every ounce of pain and exhaustion etched in his features. He looked drained, as though he hadn't slept in days, and in truth, neither of us had. He didn't say a word. Instead, he walked over and sat next to me on the couch, his movements slow, resigned. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked down at the phone in my hands, understanding immediately what I was doing. He didn't try to snatch it back, didn't get defensive. He just sat there, his shoulders hunched, his face heavy with an almost unbearable sadness. I'd expected anger or annoyance, maybe even frustration that I was still digging. Yet, if I confronted him too soon, without enough evidence, he'd have a chance to deny it, to twist the story, to lie his way out of it. No, I wanted him cornered, with no escape. One night, as I was scrolling through his contacts again, I noticed something strange. There was a number saved without a name, just a string of digits. My heart skipped a beat. Why wouldn't he name this contact? I stared at it, my mind racing, wondering if this was the woman. I imagined them meeting, exchanging numbers, and him saving her contact without a name, trying to keep it hidden. I took a screenshot, saving it to my growing collection of evidence. Every day felt like a new test, a fresh battle between my suspicion and my restraint. I'd watch him go through his routine, wondering if he suspected anything, if he felt my gaze lingering on him a bit too long, or if he noticed the coldness that had seeped into my voice. Sometimes he'd try to reach out, to hold my hand, to ask if I was okay, but I'd pull away, telling him I was just tired. And he'd nod, looking guilty, but saying nothing more. I became obsessed with watching his location. Every time he left the house, I'd pull up the app, watching the little dot move across town. He went to work, to the gym, to pick up groceries. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I kept checking, over and over, looking for anything unusual. It was like I was living two lives. One as the dutiful wife, keeping up appearances for the kids, and the other as a silent investigator, hiding in plain sight, gathering every detail, waiting for the moment to strike. One evening, he said he had to stay late at work. It was the first time in weeks he'd mentioned working late, and immediately, every alarm in my head went off. I watched the tracker as he stayed at the office well into the evening. But when I called his desk phone just to be sure, it rang and rang without answer. My mind spiraled, imagining him somewhere else, somewhere with her. Hours later, the tracker showed he was coming home, and I braced myself, forcing calmness onto my face, into my voice. I watched him walk through the door, trying to act casual as I asked him how his day was. He seemed exhausted, a little distant, as he shrugged and gave a vague answer. I wondered if he knew, if he suspected I was watching him, if he could see through the mask I'd been wearing for weeks. This dance continued for days, weeks even, until I could hardly keep track of how long I'd been living this way. It was like I was in a private war, a battle he didn't even know was happening. Every day, I tested myself, pushing my patience, my willpower, holding back the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. And every night, I lay there, exhausted, barely sleeping, the weight of my suspicions pressing down on me. There were moments when I questioned what I was doing, when I wondered if I was losing myself in this obsession, in this need for proof. But then I'd remember the night he told me, the way he'd shattered everything we'd built together, and my resolve would harden again. I'd keep digging, keep waiting, until I had enough to confront him and make him feel the weight of his betrayal. Weeks turned into this blur of days spent in tension and suspicion, each one heavier than the last. Every morning, I'd wake up feeling that familiar ache in my chest, like I was carrying around a weight that wouldn't go away. My routine had turned into something robotic. Get up, check his phone if he'd left it unlocked, scan through any new messages, check his location on the tracker, then pretend everything was normal for the kids. The anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, driving me to look, to hunt for any sign that he was still hiding something. I wasn't satisfied with his apologies or his guilt, however genuine they seemed. It felt like he owed me more than just a few "I'm sorries." I wanted answers, concrete proof, or maybe just something to justify this aching need for revenge. But I kept coming up empty. The tracker app had become almost through his life. But what I saw was far worse. A look of complete defeat, like he was finally ready to accept whatever consequences came his way. I took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Why did you do it? My voice was barely more than a whisper, carrying the weight of a question I'd already asked him a dozen times. But this time, it was different. I wasn't asking to accuse him or to make him squirm. I was asking because I needed to understand, because if I didn't know how I was supposed to let this go. I needed him to give me a reason, any reason, that would help me hate him enough to break away from this torture. He looked up, meeting my gaze with hollow eyes, and I could see the sorrow, the shame, and the exhaustion swimming in them. He didn't look away. He didn't even flinch. He just held my gaze, his own filled with regret so thick I could almost feel it in the air between us. I don't know why, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I had an answer, something that could make sense of it, but I don't. It was a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake. It was the same apology, the same explanation he'd given me that first night, but something about it was different now. His voice sounded raw, almost broken. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify his actions. He wasn't pleading for forgiveness or trying to convince me to move on. He was just sorry, in a way that was almost too heavy to bear. I sat there, staring at him, feeling something shift inside me. I could see the toll this had taken on him. He hadn't been sleeping in our bed for weeks now, staying on the couch instead. His clothes hung a little looser on him, his eyes were shadowed, and his skin had taken on a pale, worn-out look. I remembered how he used to be, the confident, lively man I'd married, the man who'd once been the center of my world. That man was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he was bearing the weight of 1,000 regrets, someone who seemed as lost as I was. I had been so focused on my own pain, on my own need for answers, that I hadn't realized he was hurting too. It dawned on me that he wasn't just carrying guilt for what he'd done. He was carrying the knowledge that he had shattered the life we'd built together. He hadn't tried to make excuses or even to fight my anger. He'd let me sift through his life, let me tear apart every detail, knowing full well that I was looking for something to make him pay, to give me a reason to leave. And yet, he had just let me. He hadn't asked me to stop, hadn't tried to speed up my process of healing. He'd simply taken it, like he knew it was his penance. He had been sitting in his own silent misery, watching me slowly unravel, and he hadn't asked for a single ounce of relief. He'd barely spoken about the affair since his confession. He hadn't tried to fix things or convince me to forgive him. He'd only said he'd be here if and when I was ready to talk. And even now, he didn't ask me to forgive him. For weeks, I'd been tearing myself apart, searching for the truth, hoping to find some secret that would justify my pain. But in that moment, I realized there was nothing left to find. No hidden affair, no double life, just one horrible, stupid mistake that neither of us knew how to move past. All my searching, all my digging, had only revealed one thing. He was still here, broken in his own way, desperately trying to find a way to fix what he'd shattered. In that quiet moment, sitting beside him, something inside me softened. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that. But it was a crack in the wall I'd built around myself. I put his phone down on the couch between us and just sat there, letting the silence fill the space between us. I felt drained, as though the weight of the past weeks had finally settled, too heavy to carry anymore. He looked down at the phone, then back at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. I know I don't deserve it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm so sorry. I'll never be able to say it enough. I'll never be able to make up for what I've done, but I'll be here, as long as you'll let me. There was no grand gesture, no sweeping declaration of love or redemption, just a quiet, honest apology, one that I could feel came from somewhere deep inside him. And somehow, that meant more than any words could have. I knew he couldn't undo what he'd done, couldn't erase the pain he'd caused. But in that moment, I realized that he was willing to try, even if it took a lifetime. As I looked at him, sitting there beside me, I could see the depth of his regret, the weight he'd been carrying since the moment he confessed. It was a turning point, not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I could see, finally, that he was suffering too, that he was genuinely sorry. And for the first time, I thought maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. One that we'd have to carve out slowly, painfully, but together. I don't know what changed in that moment. It wasn't something he said or some grand apology. Maybe it was the sheer weight of everything we'd been through, the way I could finally see how much he was carrying, how deeply he regretted the pain he'd caused. It was in the quietness of his presence, the way he looked at me, not with expectation but with a quiet, steady acceptance. He wasn't pushing me to forgive him. He just wanted to be there, willing to do whatever it took to make things right. That night, something in me softened, not in forgiveness, but in a willingness to try. I took a long breath, letting the tension fall, even if only slightly. I told him that I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but I was willing to try to find a way forward. Those words came out slowly, surprising even me, and I watched the relief in his face. It was as if he'd been holding his breath since that night he confessed, and hearing me say that I would try released him from some invisible weight he'd been carrying. But it didn't release him entirely. There was still so much work left to do, so much hurt to unpack. I wasn't letting go of it all, not yet, but I was willing to take that first step. Starting over wasn't easy. If anything, the decision to rebuild was almost harder than walking away would have been. With every step forward, I had to hold back a part of me that wanted to remind him of the pain he'd caused, to throw it in his face, to make him feel it just as deeply as I had. But I knew that wasn't the way forward. Holding on to the pain so tightly would only end up poisoning us both. I'd seen it happen in others, watched bitterness consume people and turn them into shells of who they used to be. I didn't want to live like that. I didn't want our children to see us live like that. So, we took it one day at a time. Each day a new battle between my anger and the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. We signed up for counseling, both of us wary at first, unsure of how to even begin discussing what had happened. Those sessions were brutal, filled with uncomfortable silences and raw admissions, moments where I would look at him and feel the full weight of betrayal all over again. But he showed up. Every session, he was there, open, vulnerable, doing the work without a trace of resistance. When I told him how deeply he'd hurt me, he didn't try to argue or defend himself. He just listened, absorbing every word. There was something humbling about it, seeing him so willing to face my anger without once trying to deflect. Outside of counseling, it was a slow process, rebuilding our relationship brick by brick. He took on more at home, showing up for every part of our family life. He made dinner, cleaned up, spent more time with the kids. He became the husband I'd once dreamed he would be, attentive, steady, fully present in every way he hadn't been before. I'd find myself watching him, catching these little moments where he would be playing with the kids or staying up late to finish a household chore, and I'd feel a small flicker of the warmth that had once filled our life together. It was a fragile, tentative feeling, but it was there. There were nights when I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the right decision. Was this the right path? Was it worth all the hurt, the struggle? Part of me longed for the simplicity of walking away, of cutting him out of my life and finding peace on my own terms. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something here worth fighting for. Something about the life we'd built, the family we'd created, felt like it deserved a second chance. Slowly, painfully, I started to see him as my husband again, not as the man who'd betrayed me, but as the man I'd once loved so deeply. I could see the changes in him, the way he treated me with an attentiveness that hadn't been there before. He never took a single moment for granted, always checking in, always making sure I was okay. He understood that I wasn't ready to trust him completely, and he never pushed me to. Instead, he let me set the pace, following my lead, doing everything he could to show that he was here, that he was willing to be the husband I deserved. It took months, but somewhere along the way, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It came in quiet moments, the kind you almost miss if you're not paying attention. Like when we'd sit on the porch together after putting the kids to bed, wrapped in silence but feeling a closeness I hadn't expected to feel again. Or the first time I felt safe enough to fall asleep with his arm around me, realizing in that moment that the wall I'd built around myself was finally beginning to crumble. I won't lie and say things went back to how they were. That would be impossible. The trust we'd once shared was shattered, and rebuilding it was a delicate, complicated process, one that required patience and a willingness to face every raw emotion that came up along the way. But day by day, we were creating something new, a version of our relationship that acknowledged the pain without letting it define us. It wasn't the life we'd had before, but it was something real, something we were both committed to building. As I looked at him, day after day, I began to understand that healing wasn't a straight line. There were days when I'd wake up and feel the full weight of his betrayal all over again, when I'd be tempted to bring it up, to remind him of the pain he'd caused. But each time, I'd remind myself that holding on to that pain would only keep us both trapped. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant giving myself permission to move forward, to choose love and trust even when it felt risky. In the end, our journey was far from perfect, but it was ours. It wasn't the story I'd imagined when I first found out about his betrayal, but it was one we had written together, one filled with growth, forgiveness, and a resilience I hadn't known I was capable of. Sometimes, life surprises you in ways you don't expect, leading you down paths you'd never choose for yourself. But looking back, I could see that healing had come not in one grand moment of forgiveness, but in a series of small, quiet decisions to let love in again. And maybe, in the end, that's how healing really works.